You know, it's funny. So many of the ways we instinctively think about history, society, even what it means to be human, they're actually deeply rooted in ideas from the 19th century. Ideas that are, frankly, a little bit outdated now. We use them without even realizing it was like wearing old glasses and not knowing they're tinting everything we see. Today, we're taking a deep dive into an incredibly insightful vision of human history, one that tries to, well, cut through some of those old assumptions. We're unpacking Ernest Gellner's monumental work, Plough, Sword, and Book. And our mission here, it isn't about some crystal ball, predicting the future, but rather about understanding the fundamental options that have faced humanity by truly comprehending the past. It's about clarity, really, not prophecy.
Absolutely. And a key insight from Gellner right from the start is how he gives us this really robust framework for understanding. He breaks down human history into three fundamental stages. First, the initial hunting and gathering societies, then the Agrarian Age, and finally our current industrial society. And he analyzes them through three crucial human activities that are always present: production, coercion, and cognition. We'll explore how these elements intertwined and transformed over, well, millennia, leading us to the peculiar, complex world we inhabit today.
Okay, let's unpack this idea of philosophic history, what Gellner means by this. It's our innate human need, right, to create some grand story to make sense of the past. He argues we have this inescapable need for some kind of backcloth vision of history, even if we often dismiss those sweeping narratives of, 19th century philosophers like Hegel, Marx, Comte, or Spencer. Their ideas, as he puts it, are everywhere in use. We just can't help trying to see the big picture.
Exactly. And what's striking is that Gellner isn't claiming to know the truth about history or that his vision is the final word. Not at all. He's deliberately spelling out this vision in sharpest and perhaps exaggerated outline, specifically so we can critically examine it. Which raises a question for you, our listener. Why is understanding our past options so vital, even if predicting the future is, as he says, unlikely ever to be feasible? Gellner's point is, it's about seeing how the same card, so to speak, could have been dealt out differently. It really helps us grasp the sheer contingency of where we are now.
So, what are these three principal stages Gellner identifies? The first, hunting and gathering. That's largely a baseline, right? For contrast, mankind's initial condition. Then we move into agrarian society, and he defines that by systematic food production, storage, leading to a surplus. And this, crucially, introduces inherent social enforcement dividing the surplus, external defense. Violence, which was maybe merely contingent amongst hunters, accidental, optional, maybe becomes mandatory amongst agriculturalists. That's a huge shift in how power works.
That's right, a really fundamental change. And this leads us to the third stage. Industrial society, our current era, characterized by scientific and industrial production. But if we look at the bigger picture here, Gellner really emphasizes there's no obligatory developmental pattern. It's not like steps on a ladder everyone climbs. Societies can and do get stuck in any one stage. And the transitions, especially from agrarian to industrial, well, he saw those as a near-miraculous concatenation of circumstances.
Wow, near miraculous. So basically a series of incredibly lucky, almost improbable events.
Exactly. Not something that was bound to happen, not an ineluctable destiny. The new social orders that emerged were so radically different from what came before that they could not be properly anticipated or planned or willed. Nobody saw this coming. It's only the subsequent diffusion of these orders, once they're established and successful somewhere, that can be consciously copied elsewhere. The real takeaway, I think, is that our current world wasn't some inevitable destination on history's map.
Okay, so this scheme defines these stages by their productive base. Now, a listener might naturally think, okay, is this just economic determinism, like Marx? How does Gellner address that? Where does his view differ?
Yeah, it's a fair question. He's very clear on this. Gellner states that the productive base determines our problems, but that it does not determine our solutions. And this is crucial because, as history shows us, both hunting-gathering and agrarian societies show a bewilderingly wide diversity of forms. And the same seems to be true for industrial society, too. His argument doesn't assume which sphere, production, coercion, or cognition is, the prime mover in maintaining or bringing about new forms. So yeah, economics sets the stage, definitely, but it doesn't dictate the whole play.
Okay, got it. So that covers the big historical stages. But then Gellner also gives us these three core human activities: production, coercion, and cognition as lenses, right? To understand the shifts. Let's dig into those. He highlights that the hiving off of cognition and coercion as distinct spheres of activity, like their separation into specialized areas, is at least as important as the emergence of specialization within the field of production. So it's not just about what we make, but how we organize power and how we think. That defines an era, too.
Exactly. That separation is key.
Now, let's dive into agrarian society. Gellner argues this is the crucial middle ground, the longest stretch of human history for most people. There's that famous quote attributed to the Prophet Muhammad: "Subjection enters the house with the plough." What does that mean for how agrarian societies were structured? How did the plough literally bring subjection?
It's such a powerful image, isn't it? Because the surplus generated from systematic agriculture enabled that hiving off or separation of a ruling class. And specialized ritual or doctrinal specialists, too, priests, scribes, this typically led to a widespread threefold stratification. You had the producers, the warriors, and the clerics. And Gellner suggests this structure seemed almost inherent in the logic of the situation.
Right, like it just made sense given the new reality of surplus food.
Pretty much. Even ancient philosophers like Plato schematized and legitimized this very arrangement. The core insight is that agriculture created the conditions for a specialized elite to emerge, and they then had to manage and control that newly created surplus, which fundamentally changed everything about society.
It sounds like a pretty universal model domination by warriors and clerics. Were there any exceptions, any escape routes from this?
Yeah, he points out two conspicuous ones. First, you had small communities, often pastoralists or mountain peasants. Their environment, maybe difficult terrain, allowed them to resist external domination or just made conquest not worth the effort. They could maintain internal order through a kind of balance of power principle and had widespread political participation. Think Swiss cantons, maybe. These self-governing groups often had great cohesion military skill. Sometimes they even became conquerors themselves. And the second exception was city-states. Because, as Gellner notes, trade requires initiative, which is not normally compatible with servile status. You need merchants to be somewhat free.
Ah, right. So cities could be different power centers.
Exactly. And these urban centers could also turn into conquerors, demonstrating alternative paths to power and social organization within the broader agrarian age.
Okay, so that's the structure. But Gellner also had fascinating things to say about how people thought back then, about cognition. He talks about what he calls the blatant absurdity of some primitive beliefs. He gives the example of the Newfer people identifying bowls with cucumbers in rituals. Our modern fastidiousness or, strictness about logic makes us kind of shrink from things like that. It just sounds bizarre.
It does sound bizarre to us. And the prevailing charitable view often tries to explain it away, suggesting statements like that aren't really about bowls or cucumbers, the physical things, but are really statements about the social order. Maybe the bowl represents lineage and the cucumber represents fertility, and the ritual links them socially, not literally. The idea is that the semantic complexity just misled outside observers. But Gellner argues this account is indefensible. He thinks it fails to account for what he sees as a radical discontinuity between primitive and modern ways of thinking.
So he's saying don't just explain it away, try to understand how their minds actually worked differently.
Precisely. We need to grasp the fundamental difference, not just smooth it over.
Okay, so Gellner proposes a different, more nuanced understanding of primitive thought then. What's his take? Because the real punchline here, I think, is showing how our objective thinking is actually a pretty radical, relatively new invention.
That's exactly it. He introduces this really useful concept, multi-strand versus single-strand activities or thinking. Primitive people, Gellner argues, conflated and intertwined diverse functions and aims in their actions and their statements. Their assertions served multiple criteria all at once. So, for example, that statement about bowls and cucumbers might also be a reaffirmation of social loyalty, or a prayer for rain, or a way of classifying kinship, all wrapped up together.
Ah, okay, so not just one single meaning or purpose.
Right, whereas in our modern society, he points out, we systematically inculcate, we teach, and we highly prize the clear separation of aims. We want clarity, distinctness. Is this statement factual? Is it symbolic? Is it a command? Primitive thought, by contrast, was this rich, interwoven tapestry where everything was connected.
So, if I'm getting this right, primitive language was not primarily referential, meaning it wasn't just about describing a reality, pointing at things, and its links to nature were meshed in with other elements and could not fuse into a single pure referential account. It was embedded in the social fabric.
Exactly, precisely. And this multi-strandedness, this entanglement, explains why such thought systems had little or any potential for growth or improvement in terms of purely objective knowledge. It was actually inhibited by its very structure because there wasn't that singular focus on tracking reality accurately above all else. This leads Gellner to distinguish two kinds of truth, if you like. There's referential use. A statement is true because it correctly links to nature, to facts. And then there's shared concept affirmation. A statement is true or right because it conforms to the group's normative expectations, its values, its social rules.
Okay, so concepts weren't just abstract ideas back then.
No, they encapsulate and communicate and authorize a shared way of classifying, valuing a shared range of social and natural expectations and obligations. They were highly disciplined, and crucially, they discipline us. The real insight here isn't that primitive thought was simply wrong. It was designed primarily for social cohesion, with objective truth playing a secondary role.
That makes sense. This multi-strandedness meant that, as Gellner puts it, nature speaks only through delegations sent in by the subsystems, and within each such delegation, its messages only constitute a minority. It sounds like a world where objective facts couldn't just stand up on their own and demand attention. They were always outvoted by social needs.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. This structure makes it possible to subordinate the referential to the exigencies of the social, basically making sure that no fact will ever brazenly overturn the vision that is socially preferred. Most pre-scientific societies, Gellner contends, used this mechanism to build a tolerably coherent world picture, a world where the background story, the social organization, and natural facts all seemed to fit together, to be congruent. So they had high social coherence. Everything felt connected and meaningful within the group. But by our modern standards, they had low logical coherence. Their world was a unified cosmos, yes, but not one subject to a single objective standard of truth.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. That's a profound observation about primitive thought. But then if we fast forward to us, to modern cognitively progressive societies, what's Gellner's take on our own coherence? Are we still unified? Or have we maybe, sacrificed something in the name of that logical clarity?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? He argues that modern, cognitively progressive societies possess a high level of logical coherence. All facts can be cross-related, fitted into a single logical space. We can have objective science, universal laws. That's our strength. But, and this is a huge but, they generally lack social coherence.
Yeah.
Their moral and cognitive orders simply do not constitute any unity.
Wow. So we traded social unity for logical unity.
That's the provocative argument. We've gained immense logical clarity, this powerful way of understanding the physical world, but we've paid for it with a loss of shared meaning, a unified moral framework that everyone buys into. Our facts and our values are divorced.
So this begs the question then, how did we get from that multi-stranded, socially coherent, but maybe logically messy world to here?
It was a long, complex process, obviously. But Gellner highlights some crucial steps. One was the introduction of literacy, and especially its deployment in religion, leading to what he calls scripturalism. Think about sacred texts like the Bible or the Quran. Literacy made possible the codification and logical centralization of doctrine. Writing things down demands a certain consistency, a move towards a more unified system of thought compared to fluid oral traditions.
Right, you can point to the text and say this is what it says.
Exactly. And then later, you get Platonism emerging in ancient Greece. This explicitly articulated the idea of the independent existence of concepts, ideas. This was a new and significant twist. Man realized, as Gellner puts it, that he not merely speaks prose, but knows that he's doing so. He became self-aware of his conceptual framework as something separate, something ideal. And the authority of these norm concepts, these ideal universal forms, became universalized. They weren't just local customs anymore. They aimed for universal truth.
Okay, so literacy and philosophy start pushing towards consistency and universal ideas.
Precisely. And then later still, the emergence in the Abrahamic traditions of a unique and jealous God constituted an overwhelmingly powerful impulse toward the establishment of a single-strand system. This kind of deity, Gellner argues, insisted on the avoidance of easy cohabitation, of multiple diverse ways of speaking and thinking, untroubled by their failure to cohere in a single logical system. One God, one truth. This wasn't just a theological shift. Gellner suggests it profoundly modified the human spirit. It paved the way for a world where logical consistency wasn't just desirable, but divinely mandated, fundamentally altering how people thought about truth itself.
Okay, let's shift back to the structure of agrarian society for a moment. We've seen it was dominated by coercion, producers, traders. They were constantly vulnerable to spoliation, right? Warriors just taking their stuff. Wealth was often linked to religion, maybe for protection or legitimacy. It's actually hard to imagine how productive activity, making and trading things, could ever come to dominate society under those conditions.
Indeed. Gellner really emphasizes that. Everything in the standard condition of agrarian society militates against such a miracle. It just seems stacked against the rise of the producer or the merchant. So he offers several candidate explanations for how this seemingly stable structure could possibly be modified so dramatically. Two really important ones he discusses are, first, feudalism as a matrix for capitalism. In theory, at least, feudal relationships were contractual, based on mutual obligation, which allowed for a curious free market and loyalty, not just rigid hierarchy. And second, the church-state dualism, unique to Western Europe. A centralized clergy gained a kind of monopoly of legitimacy, which allowed it to challenge temporal kingly power.
Ah, like the Pope versus the Emperor.
Exactly. Events like Canossa, where a Holy Roman Emperor humbled himself before the Pope, show this dynamic. This separation, Gellner argues, sets limits to the rapaciousness of the state. It created a space where other powers, including perhaps economic ones, could grow. The profound insight here is that these cracks, these specific institutional arrangements in one part of the world, created the openings for something radically new to emerge.
This whole discussion, especially the religious angle, reminds me strongly of Max Weber's famous ideas about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. What's Gellner's take on the role of Protestantism in this transformation? Does he agree with Weber?
He definitely engages with Weber. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Gellner posits that in a Protestant world, particularly Calvinist strand Weber focused on, you lose the sacramentally distinct priesthood. There's no intermediary. Instead, you have a symmetrical population of individual believers, each facing a symmetrical and orderly world subject to firm laws created by God. This equality of concepts, where no ideas are sacred or off-limits just because a priest says so, makes genuine theoretical exploration possible, because visions are no longer ritually controlled. And an inscrutable and hidden deity, one who doesn't reveal secrets arbitrarily, kind of obliges men to investigate nature impartially, to figure out God's will through his creation. You have to look at the world systematically.
So it inadvertently promoted a scientific mindset.
That's the argument. The key takeaway is how a specific theological shift inadvertently laid the groundwork for both modern scientific inquiry and a certain kind of economic rationality.
Okay, so Protestantism fostered both this instrumental rationality, figuring out how things work, and maybe also a non-instrumental honesty in dealings, leading to more widespread trust needed for commerce. And the idea of vocation, the calling, that seems absolutely key in destroying the old stigma attached to just making or trading things, right?
Absolutely crucial. It destroys the presumption that it is a pisal, which basically means a second-best option, an inferior alternative to being a priest or a warrior, the prestigious roles in agrarian society. Productive activity could now acquire full droit de cité, full citizenship, and dignity. It was a legitimate, even God-pleasing way to live your life.
And that meant people stayed in business.
Yes. This was vital because it allowed successful merchants or craftsmen to remain in their professions, reinvesting their profits rather than immediately trying to convert their wealth into land, titles, or political power, which was the standard move in most agrarian societies. This allowed for the accumulation of capital and the development of specialized economic roles in a way that just hadn't happened systematically before.
It really sounds like the Reformation was an absolutely pivotal moment in this grand historical narrative Gellner is painting.
It was pivotal, certainly. But Gellner is careful. He treats Reformation as a generic concept. He points out there's an endemic tension, a constant push and pull throughout agrarian history between universalistic egalitarian doctrines, often found in the high religions, and the local community-reinforcing traditions. The unique thing, the real world changer, was the success of one particular Reformation, the one in Western Europe, in becoming permanent. It initiated radical and irreversible changes in a way other reform movements hadn't.
So it wasn't that the desire for reform was unique, but its success in actually shifting the power balance and sticking.
Exactly. Its enduring implementation in a way that truly shifted the balance between coercion, cognition, and production. That's what transformed the world.
And this, he says, leads directly to the Enlightenment, which Gellner calls the codification and outline of the world we now inhabit. That's a big claim.
It is a big claim. And a compelling aspect of his work is the logical connection he draws here. He argues that the Protestant habit of scrutinizing institutions against Scripture, well, it naturally led people to start scrutinizing everything, including Scripture itself, against new standards like reason or fact or nature. This created a world where, surprisingly perhaps, a strong civil society, conjoined with a relatively weak or at least non-dominant central state, proved more powerful than more thoroughly centralized polities.
How so?
He cites the example of how the less centralized British monarchy repeatedly defeated the more absolutist French one in the 18th century. Power wasn't just about top-down control anymore, so the Enlightenment was both an analysis of these changes that were already happening, and it became an inquest into underdevelopment for those societies that hadn't reformed yet. Why were we falling behind?
That's a striking idea, philosophy having real-world military and political consequences.
Absolutely. And figures like Descartes seem to embody this shift. Gellner calls his philosophy a kind of bourgeois Platonism.
Bourgeois Platonism, what does that mean?
It means valuing those clear and distinct concepts, ideas that serve but one purpose at a time. Very efficient, very focused, not multi-stranded like before. And Descartes helped establish a cognitively benevolent deity, a God who wouldn't deceive us, who guaranteed that our clear and distinct intellectual operations could actually grasp a reality. It created confidence in reason.
So, a very neat, orderly world, mentally speaking.
It does seem that way. And Gellner says this highlights the atomization of evidence, the individualization of men, the separation of questions. Everything is broken down into clear, manageable parts. It's a double declaration of independence. He calls it independence for the thinking self and independence for nature, which is now seen as a separate realm governed by its own laws, ready to be studied. And genuine knowledge in this new Enlightenment world becomes inherently egalitarian.
How is knowledge egalitarian?
Because it allows no privileged sources, testers, messengers of truth. In science, ideally, evidence speaks for itself. It doesn't matter if the observation comes from a king or a commoner. It's judged by its fit with other evidence. That's a profound democratic shift in how we think about knowing things.
Right. And the sovereignty of experience became the new guiding principle. Gellner puts it starkly. The idea that we learn in no other way totally transforms the world. This led to the dethronement of concepts as these sacred, ordained things from on high. Instead, they became a mere public convenience, tools valued for their efficiency rather than their honor.
Exactly. Authority now lies within us and us only, or rather within the shared systematic method of empirical investigation.
Okay, so fast forward again. The 19th century takes these Enlightenment ideas and gives us the faith in progress, right? This belief in a society based on sustained, perpetual cognitive and economic growth. And it tried to restore that old unification of fact and value that earlier societies had, but on a new, rational basis.
Yes. Through grand systems like Hegelianism or Marxism or Comte's positivism. But Gellner notes that this last great generation of metaphysics, these grand theories acting as God surrogates, they've kind of lost their bloom in the 20th and 21st centuries, which leaves us in what he describes as ideological perturbation, a state of, well, disquiet and confusion about our fundamental beliefs and values. We have the growth, but maybe not the unified meaning.
So what about coercion in this modern world? We have this amazing productive capacity, this powerful cognition, but what about sheer force?
Well, Gellner points out a fundamental difference. Economic advantage is divisible, calculable, and negotiable. You can haggle over price, measure profit precisely. But coercion, state power, ultimately operates in a realm of incommensurate, stark, yes-no absolutes. The ultimate sanction is the infliction of death. It's not easily divisible or negotiable.
That's a stark contrast, the fine adjustments of the market versus the blunt force of the state. Yet modern societies seem, on the surface at least, relatively orderly. How does that work?
It's a puzzle. Gellner suggests that the sheer complexity and interdependence of modern industrial society and its reliance on a vast, fragile infrastructure actually make its members quite docile and habituated to obedience to bureaucratic instructions. We need the system to work. He points to some striking examples, like Czechoslovakia after the Soviet invasion in 1968. A detested regime was imposed without a single execution or political murder, remarkably.
How did they manage that?
By targeting the professional middle class, the doctors, engineers, managers, not with violence, but with threats to their children's education or their ability to do meaningful work. A kind of soft, bureaucratic coercion, but devastatingly effective. It showed a new kind of power dynamic.
That's just the power balance between the state and civil society is really, really different now compared to, say, the Enlightenment.
Hugely different. The military equipment available to the modern state is just overwhelmingly powerful compared to anything citizens could muster. Gellner states bluntly that open and outright resistance by civil society against the state is barely conceivable in a purely military sense.
So no more revolutions like the English or American ones.
It's a striking contrast, isn't it? Yeah. Back in 17th and 18th century Britain, the monarchy was, quote, decisively defeated by its own citizenry on the battlefield. Gellner says that kind of balance of military strength is not something that we shall ever see again.
Mhm.
And this makes him ponder, quite soberly, how frequently power will be liberal rather than totalitarian in the modern age, given the state's enormous coercive advantage. It's a worrying thought.
Okay, let's loop back to cognition for a moment. You mentioned the Enlightenment's reliance on experience, but isn't there a problem of circularity there? Our objective cognition uses experience as its ultimate judge, right? But then, especially in the 20th century, we started to learn that experience is meretricious and malleable. It's misleading, easily shaped. It's always pre-molded by our prior framework or paradigm, as Thomas Kuhn would say. So how can experience really be an objective judge if it's always filtered through the very theories it's supposed to judge?
Exactly. You've hit on a core philosophical problem. If there is no experience without paradigms, as the argument goes, then how can experience possibly adjudicate between paradigms? The answer, Gellner argues quite logically, is that on the premises of that argument, there simply cannot be one. Experience alone can't give us a neutral standpoint outside of all frameworks to judge those frameworks. And this highlights the inherent problem of applying a single, supposedly rational or empirical criterion to really complex, multi-stranded realities like morality or culture, or even choosing between fundamental scientific theories. They don't always fit neatly into those objective boxes.
That makes sense. The neat Enlightenment picture gets complicated.
Very complicated. The profound insight here is that even our most powerful way of knowing objective scientific cognition seems to hit a wall when it comes to judging its own foundations or dealing with things that aren't easily quantifiable.
And does this limitation spill over into other aspects of modern life, like, say, choosing leaders for top jobs or even our personal relationships?
Gellner thinks it absolutely does. He argues we often resort to intuitive evaluation, and what he amusingly calls oracle surrogates in these situations. Why? Because the criteria for judgment are just too multiple and incommensurate.
Too many factors, none easily comparable.
Exactly. Think about choosing a CEO or even a life partner. How do you rationally weigh charisma versus technical skill versus integrity versus, shared hobbies? It's incredibly complex. So we fall back on intuition, on gut feeling. He points to the cult of romantic love and the coup de foudre, that sudden, overwhelming feeling of love at first sight, as a prime example.
Love at first sight as an oracle.
In a way, yes. He calls it a cover-up for the inability to give good reasons. Basically, when we say it just felt right about a major life decision, whether it's love or hiring someone, we're invoking our personal internal oracle. We're doing it because a purely rational, calculative decision based on clear criteria is often impossible in these complex, multi-stranded human situations. It's a very human, perhaps even necessary way to navigate when the spreadsheets fail us.
That's a really interesting take on romance. Okay, so if we look towards the future, through Gellner's three lenses, production, coercion, cognition, what does he see? What are the big dynamics?
Okay, let's break it down, starting with production. The productive explosion of industrialism takes us into an age of potential plenty. But Gellner argues that there cannot be a single, well-defined overall aim for production anymore. It's not just about making more stuff. Production becomes shaped by complex lifestyles, roles, positions, by consumer desires, by symbolic meanings, not just raw material needs. It gets fuzzy.
Okay, what about cognition? How we think and know?
This, Gellner suggests, is actually the most optimistic area. Its defining feature is open-ended perpetual growth. And unlike production, perhaps, this does not engender any internal contradiction. Its single aim, the formulation of ever more powerful and more general explanatory predictive theories, seems feasible and, relatively speaking, relatively easy compared to solving social problems. Science works.
And finally, coercion, the organization of power.
Well, this remains the most serious, the most problematic. The sheer scale and complexity of modern infrastructure, energy grids, communication networks, global trade cannot but be the concern of the central power. The state has to be involved. So the crucial question for our future is how this central power is organized and checked, especially, he notes, in conditions simultaneously of moral premiselessness, that lack of a shared moral foundation we talked about, and of great economic leeway, the sheer wealth modern societies generate. How do we manage immense state power when we don't fully agree on the rules and when there's so much wealth potentially up for grabs or misuse? That's the core political dilemma.
So we've journeyed from societies where moral and cognitive orders reinforced each other through the Great Separation to our current state where they're largely divorced. Gellner raises this interesting question near the end. What happens when consumption overtakes production and becomes the dominant element informing the human psyche? Does that change things again?
It's a fascinating speculation. Gellner points out that the first miracle, the emergence of our modern world, happened when men, for obscure reasons, persisted in working a set of levers not yet known to work. They were driven by faith, by conviction, by Weber's Protestant ethic, maybe even by accident. They didn't know it would lead to industrial society. But today, societies often adopt technical rationality instrumentally, simply because it's already known to be effective. You adopt science and technology because they deliver the goods, not necessarily because you deeply believe in the underlying philosophical worldview.
Ah, so you can use the tools without buying the whole Enlightenment package.
That's the implication. This suggests provocatively that the computer and the shrine may be compatible. You could have a future where a highly efficient, technically rational economy exists quite comfortably, alongside an expressive, symbolic, maybe even anti-rational culture. The foundational spirit of inquiry that launched our world might not actually be necessary to sustain it, as long as the technology simply works and delivers affluence. It's a slightly chilling thought, perhaps.
So wrapping this up, Gellner has offered us this, well, schematic but really powerful understanding of human history. He sees it not as some predetermined march, but as a series of near-miraculous accidents almost that led to our unique modern world, a world where cognition, science, thrives with seemingly endless potential for growth, but where the social consequences of our radical divisions of labor, the separation of fact and value, and the transformation of coercion present entirely new, maybe unprecedented challenges.
Yeah, we've traced how our current state, defined by the subjective, unified, referential style of cognition on one hand, and mass affluence on the other, emerged from these profound, interconnected changes in production, coercion, and how we think. And this whole journey really highlights the fragility, the sheer contingency of our unique social contract. It reminds us that nothing about our world was inevitable, and it emerged through often unintended consequences of collective actions and beliefs over centuries.
And so maybe the biggest question Gellner leaves us with, for you, the listener, to take away is this. If our modern world excels at finding objective truths about nature, if our referential validity is incredibly strong, but those truths no longer provide automatic moral guidance or a shared sense of meaning, where do we find our values now? What happens when knowledge empowers us immensely, but, as Gellner puts it, the nature of things had become morally mute?
How do we navigate when the map shows the terrain perfectly but tells us nothing about where we ought to go?
It's a compelling, maybe even urgent thought for our complex times.